about the 10 strategies that are appropriate to use in extreme arid desert climates. Today we're going to be going through a list of essentially case studies that you should be able to use throughout the rest of your careers, so long as you practice in the desert. These are going to be from different areas around the world, and the reason I'm showing you different ones is so you can see how the same strategies can be applied in different regions, despite having different cultures, backgrounds, religions. A lot of the ways in which we build continue to be the same. So we're actually going to start out in an area that's not so much a desert as it is an arid region, very hot subtropical region. We're going to go over to Zimbabwe, where we're going to be looking at a really interesting case study, which is called the Eastgate Center. Now the Eastgate Center, you'll notice, is a very complex looking building. It has a lot of surface area. Does anyone want to guess why, based on the strategies that we talked about, there is so much intricacy on the external facade?
Circulate wind.
What was that?
Circulate wind.
A little bit to circulate and ventilate the building. But most importantly, why do you need, yes?
Is it to shade from the sun?
It's also to shade from the sun. But why is it articulated so massy?
Is it thermal mass?
Yes, it's a way of making thermal mass. So you'll notice that the actual balconies, louvers, shade, screens, whatever you want to call them, do come out quite far from the facade itself. Reason being is, yes, number one, we do want to shade, and you'll notice that most of the actual skin of the building, where we actually have the windows, is fully shaded by this point, so the walls are actually not really absorbing anything. But then what we see is actually absorbing the heat is a screen that is around 5 to 7 feet outside of the actual building envelope. And on top of that, it's not just a thin little metal screen, it is a very, very thick stone screen. And the reason for that is the more mass you can get out there to really bring in the heat, the less it's going to be dissipated into those inner walls. So you always want to find ways to add volume and body to the exterior of your buildings so that it's a lot harder for that heat to get inside. Right there, you see a close-up. What you'll also notice are all these holes, and those are for ventilation, because when they proposed this building, they told them that they could not afford to have a mechanical system. So they had certain constraints, including budgets, that would not allow them to be giving maintenance to a bunch of AC systems. It does get really hot in this region. And so they decided that what they were going to do is make an entire building that worked passively. At the most, it would just use a couple of fans, but it was not actually going to be using a full AC system. So what you'll notice is we do have some verandas with some greenery already. It might not look like a lot, but just passing through the plants, the transpiration on those leaves are going to help to cool down the air by at least a couple of degrees. But the concept and the inspiration for this building was actually a termite mound. And the reason the architect had to go look for some other interesting source of inspiration is because when we use biomimicry, which is the process of mimicking what biology or nature naturally does in order to cool itself down, we're able to find solutions that are completely passive, because termites obviously are not going to be using AC to cool themselves, and yet they are able to create structures that are entirely passive and that we can begin to take notes from. So the termite hill is very similar to the concepts we've already talked about. You can see there's a good amount of thermal mass. The whole thing is made out of dirt or sand. Then we do have our wind channels coming in, and notice that they are at the bottom in the same way that our windows to let wind in from the corners should be towards the bottom. And then we have an entire solar chimney up on top, so the heat escapes outwards. And notice the way in which they carve it is both horizontally to get the cool air in, and then vertically to let the heat come out. So this was the concept that they were trying to go for with the Eastgate Center, and it ended up looking like this diagrammatically, where we do see that at the very bottom we do have some fans, but they don't actually push out any type of cold air. It's simply ventilating the same air at just whatever the room temperature happens to be. They do source it from the exterior over here, because again, cool air is going to sink towards the bottom. Because this building also does create a lot of shade, it is quite tall, the air towards the bottom is going to be really cool. The whole center of it is going to be an open air atrium, and once again we have convection currents, so the dense air at the bottom is also sucked into those fans, and then it's distributed back through each floor. So as the air comes up this way, it's let out over here. The reason we usually want to let out cool air closer to the windows is because that's where we have the most solar heat gain. So you want to start cooling the air down right here. We don't have to worry too much about this region. It's naturally going to be cooler. As the air heats up, we do have it sucked into our solar chimney, which then expels it towards the top. So very similar, right? We have our cold horizontals and then our warm verticals. There's another diagram if you want to take a look at it. But basically it works during the night as well as during the day, right? So at night we do have warmer temperatures at the bottom, be able to permeate the building, and then during the day we want the cooler temperatures coming in. You'll notice that the inside is a whole open air atrium, right? It is not, again, air conditioned. Though it reads like an interior volume, it is very much an exterior volume. All it does is it has a nice glass canopy out here in order for the heat to be able to escape out on top. And you'll notice that once again, even on the interior, we do have a good amount of thermal mass because that is a glass canopy up there. So you know you're going to have solar heat coming into the building on the interior facades as well, especially at noon. And you want to be able to shade even those walls. Once again, we also have the same greenery on these upper floors as well. You can tell that this is a bit of a high-tech type of building from the 80s. And there we see some of the vents over here as well, bringing in cool air into the building. Right. Now we're going to move up to the actual sub-Saharan desert. So we're going to talk about Burkina Faso. This is the region where David Francis Correa is from. Did anyone study him for your second collage? I know at least 2 of you signed up for him, but I guess they're not here today. Alrighty, so Francis Correa to date is the only African designer to have won the Pritzker Prize, and some of the work we're going to see today is the reason why it was awarded to him, which I think is a great step forward, given that it is very different from the traditional modernist glass boxes that we've mostly seen Pritzker Prize winners be creating. So he's originally from Burkina Faso, right? It's a region that is, for the most part, on the northern side of the Sahara Desert. The southern region is going to be more of our savanna region. It is a region that also suffers from desertification, meaning that we're having more and more deserts as trees are being cut down. So there are a lot of things at stake environmentally in this region. He eventually moved to Germany. This is where he has his practice. And what I love the most about his architecture is he does have his own foundation. He does host benefits and galas in order to raise funds to create structures back in his home country and his hometown. So today we're going to be looking at a couple of them, including the Gangling Primary School. You'll notice that the region is, again, pretty much a desert. There's a couple trees here and there, but it is still very, very dry and very hot. This primary school was also built in a region that could not really afford to have the mechanical system, nor could they afford to give it the maintenance, right? And so Francis Correa decided that what he was going to do was employ a lot of the strategies that we already talked about to create a school that was entirely passive and would allow the students inside of it to stay quite cool. So right away, the most obvious one, what is he doing right here?
Double roof.
Yep, he has his double roof. And remember I told you that the double ceiling is used more in desert climates, and then the double roof is used more where we have some wood available to us, or we have some more industrial materials, which in this case he was able to acquire. He's using the local vernacular. You'll notice a lot of homes do use zinc for the roofs, and he's using that same technology in order to put it on the school so it reads like it's a part of the community. He's not imposing a German Bauhaus style or a modernist style on the community. On the inside, though it is fully shaded, you'll notice that there is a great amount of sunlight being allowed in. The strategy he uses here are of course very limited window openings. They do open towards the bottom to allow cool air in, but they also use the strategy of reflectivity. So as the sun comes in, it does bounce off of these louvers. So anytime you have, they're not curtains, they're called shade systems in your homes, you'll notice that most of them are going to be white, right? You want to keep them horizontal so that as this daylight comes in, it bounces off of it and reflects back into your ceiling. So you'll notice the ceiling, although it's made out of clay, it is fully illuminated because of the light bouncing back. And he did choose yellow on purpose because yellow counteracts the blue from the sky. So anytime you want to create a really warm looking interior, you do need to be able to manipulate how the daylight comes into the building. Some architects use yellow, others use red, some use orange in order to balance out the blueness of the sky. There is our area between the actual ceiling of the building and then the double roof that we're seeing here. And so you'll notice that at no point throughout the entire year does the ceiling ever absorb any type of daylight or sunlight. What we see here is vernacular materials made by the people of Gonda. So these are created by the school children and their parents, and then all of them together have created the school. These clay tiles are permeable, which allows us to have the hot air rise and go into the actual bricks and then exhale towards the top. So the whole building is very breathable. There's a little cross section. And again, you'll notice it's a very humble building. There's not really a lot of technology in it. There's no interior daylight, there's no mechanical system, and yet the whole thing functions really well. And I would argue it's even a better classroom than the one we're sitting in right now, which has no natural daylight. Right, the other thing about a double roof that's really great is the ventilation. So as the heat dissipates through those clay ceiling tiles and it just kind of hangs out around that region, because you're creating a really big opening, it is quite aerodynamic, and so you allow the wind to pass through it, and because you do have a lot of heat there, it is going to suction in the cold wind and push it outwards. So it allows you to have a pretty cool interior. And there's construction, very simple. As an extension to that, they did commission the very small library. Now this library is really quite beautiful because of what happens on the ceiling and on the roof itself, which I think you can already see from here. So what Francis Correa did in this instance was he did invite the community to use their local arts and crafts, which for the most part are going to be the pottery that they create. And then he had this great idea, how can we bring light into a library in a way that is representative of the local community? And so he had them create all of these jars, and then they pretty much set them into the ceiling, and that's where the daylight is allowed to come into the space to create something that looks like this, right? And so though it looks really dark because of the exposure of the actual picture, it's actually a very well-lit space, and you'll notice that there are no actual windows on the sides over here. Excuse me. Why would we not want windows coming into a library with a lot of direct sunlight? Yes.
Too hot.
It's too hot, but specifically for a library, yes.
Would it harm the books?
It would harm the books. So that's one of the most important considerations that you need to have when designing a library space. You do not want direct sunlight on your books. And he does that masterfully right here. Instead of having the sunlight come in from the sides, he has it come in from the top. It is very diffused by the time it gets here. And because the clay is once again a thermal mass, not only does it act as a way for daylight to come in, it also allows the space to ventilate upwards. You'll notice he does have, once again, aerodynamic curves so that the air can easily sweep in. There is also no mechanical system in this library. And then, of course, the whole thing is going to be a bunch of thermal mass. The ceiling, the floors, the walls themselves are all thermal masses that are going to pretty much keep the heat inside of the mass and not allow it to come to the interior. This is another one. This is a school as well. Sorry, it's a medical center, I believe. Let's see. No, this is a school. So with this school, what he's using are a couple of the other strategies that we haven't yet covered. So you'll notice, first of all, he is using some kind of vertical elements. So what are those going to be most likely?
Breeze.
What are these things that are sticking out?
Catchers.
Wind catchers or?
Skylights.
Or skylights? Or what was the other function of the wind catcher?
Heat chimneys.
Yes, heat chimneys. So they act as both in this case. They also help capture some daylight. You'll notice in this case, he is using the idea of enclosure. So in this case, we are having a full courtyard created by the way in which the building envelops that interior. We do have a little bit of greenery there. Once again, he is using a double roof in this case because of the climate that he is working in. Notice that they do create these massive overhangs so that, again, if the sun is up here, you're not going to allow your actual thermal mass to receive much daylight. Over here, you're going to see his windows are all operable. And again, they're not really glass windows, they're just screen systems. They open up just enough to allow the cool air to come in at the bottom, not at the top. And they're coming in again from the courtyard. So as we start to create a microclimate down here, that could be 1 to 2 degrees cooler, that wind is then going to come in and begin to cool the building. On the inside, we have a very interesting ceiling system. So here we see the daylight and the wind catcher and the solar chimney and the daylight all in one. So we do have our windows up here to make sure we don't have rain come in, but we also have small vents on the sides over here so that the air can dissipate outwards. What we see right here, though, is a very interesting double ceiling. So in this case, he's using a double roof and a double ceiling, which means that this is going to be a very, very cool building. And what you'll notice is there are small slits. So all of this is made out of clay, once again, the vernacular that is used in the region. He does have little slits in it in order to allow daylight to come in a very diffused manner. Notice that it is painted white, so it's kind of like the roof domes we talked about where they have perforations. In this case, they're more like a barrel vault, but the same thing applies. When you have a rounded surface, it's more likely to bounce the light within itself and then down past. And so that allows you to have really great daylight down there, but also trap the heat between the actual roof and then that secondary ceiling. Then that heat is dissipated up into the area up here, which is then pushed out by the wind underneath the double roof. Right, so we have very, very limited electricity in this case. We do have a little bit of it, couple of fluorescents, but the way in which he's articulated the ceiling allows you to have very limited lighting features because it bounces right back off. So you really need about half the amount that you would normally need with these, where you just kind of downcast. If you were to make them go upwards, so you'll notice these longer ones, they cast their light upwards, they reflect off of these curved surfaces and come back down. If we didn't have those, this room would look quite dark despite having a bunch of lighting inside of it. So you always want to pay attention to making sure your light bounces upwards to come back down, because that's going to be much more comfortable to work with versus direct downlight. If anyone's ever sat in the art hall, the lecture halls in the art area, there's like 1 or 2 lights that always stay on during lecture, and if you sit right underneath it, you're just like bathed in light and you can't look at your notes, and you also can't really see the screen because all the light is on you, but the rest of the room is really dark. So pointing your lights upwards, always a really good idea. Other thing he does here, what do we call this? Strategy number 10, I believe.
A veranda?
Yes, a veranda. This is what a veranda would look like, articulated in a very different way from what we saw in the Persian houses that we were looking at on Tuesday. So in this case, the veranda is made up of a bunch of logs, twigs, trees pretty much. These are going to be made out of eucalyptus. Now, eucalyptus was used in the 90s in Burkina Faso because they were trying to combat the desertification of that region. So in order to combat it, you just need to plant a lot more trees so that the roots will allow the soil to stay intact, and you're not going to have all these sandstorms that are going to push the desert further into the continent. The problem with the eucalyptus trees was that they actually require a lot of water, and they don't really provide anything. They're not great to build with. They're actually a nuisance for the environment. And so Francis Curry proposed a veranda that, yes, it's made out of wood in a region that is for the most part a desert, but it was done for a good reason. We actually don't really want these trees around anymore, so you might as well use them to construct, because they're a really great material to build things like this with, because eucalyptus tend to be very strong trees. And so now we have a veranda, and what the veranda offers us is, first of all, the whole actual skin of the building is fully shaded at all times of day, given that it's morning or sunset. As the sun comes in this way, you're not really going to have a lot of it touching the actual building. And secondly, I think you can see how it activates the space, right? By having this veranda in here, it does create a secondary space that's not really the actual part of the interior, but reads as though it's almost like a hallway in which you wait to go into your classroom. He does place a little bit of the plumbing outside. This is also a really great way to promote sanitation, especially in elementary schools. You usually want to have some kind of hand washing system for kids to wash their hands, where the teacher can see it, right? And where you can come back from recess and not everyone is piling up to go back into the bathrooms. So this is a really great method. A lot of trailheads use it as well. If you go hiking in, not Slum Canyon, but if you go to Red Rock, you'll notice that they do have outdoor washing stations like this. It just makes more sense. You don't have to go into a physical bathroom in order to cleanse yourself. This other one is in Kenya, so now we're moving into the Horn of Africa over here. This is also by Kareem. He's just a really great architect, and I wanted to show you a lot of his buildings. But this is a campus. This is for older students. Once again, you will notice there are vertical protrusions on the entirety of the campus, which are going to act as our wind catchers and as our solar chimneys. I believe in this case they are only solar chimneys. I don't think they're wind catchers. First off, we have the sense of enclosure, right? So we're now creating a microclimate. Here we have our actual solar chimneys. So notice that because we don't have an X at the top there, we can't really funnel the air to come back in. And I told you that if you don't have that X, all that's going to happen is the air moves in horizontally and it just takes out the hotter air up top. And so we know that this for sure is only going to function as that solar chimney. But what he does here is he creates this double skin within the actual wall. And so that allows the bottom floor over here, which would normally not have access to that solar chimney, to now be able to ventilate itself up into that second story and up out into the air as well. Once again, our openings only really open towards the bottom to catch in that cool air, not towards the top. This was also inspired by a termite mound, and I think you can really see the shape of it. This is the one that they actually found on site, the one that inspired him, and this is where he drew his forms from. All right, now we're going to move into India. So India, on the western region, does have a pretty large desert. We're going to talk about this, which is going to be a village that was constructed for a sports complex back in like the 1980s. And today it is still very densely inhabited. You can see they're using a lot of the same techniques that we already saw, building back to back, having courtyards, a little bit of vertical density, but not too tall. You only want to go around 3 stories before you start losing a lot of your daylight, thermal massing. But it is a master planned modernist community, right? There are modernist principles here without necessarily having to use glass and white cubes and steel. We're still able to fully express the ideas of the time. So the idea behind this is they wanted to create a campus that was fully walkable. Though the automobile was already present in the 80s and everyone was using it, they didn't want to make it the primary means of travel within the community. And that's one of the things that's the problem with Las Vegas's communities, right? If you go to any suburb, it's really not inviting to walk out from your house all the way to the street to go catch a bus. There's very little shade. A lot of the buildings are set back around 15 to 20 feet off the sidewalk, so there's no way you're going to get self-shading right there. And then most of our bus stops might have a little bit of shade, but they're only going to work if you're directly under them at noon. They're not going to work for sunset or sunrise. But with something like this, you're able to create a lot of nooks and crannies where you can have fully shaded areas without necessarily having to have an actual shade cover. Right? So they are made out of concrete, a modern fluid material. But notice they're not really brutalist. They did use pigments to add a little bit of warmth to the building itself, which is why I tend to like Indian modernism a lot. It does look a little bit warmer than what's done usually in Northern Europe or in the Northern US, where it's very cold and makes it look super brutalist. This right here looks a little bit warmer. Again, we have self-shading and we have courtyards permeated all throughout it. So as the wind moves through, we can see all the way to the end of the axes. The wind will be channeled through, it will cool down, and it will be able to enter the homes, which should, for the most part, be cross-ventilated. Right at the top, all of the roofs are fully accessible. Which modernist architect argued for the roof terrace as part of their 5 points?
Corbusier?
Yes. So we're using strategies from Corbusier. Why do you think Northern India is fond of his ideas? What did we talk about Corbu doing in India?
Designed the Chandigarh complex?
Yes, yes, he designed the Chandigarh complex. And so the ideas that Core brought there really spread out over time. So by the time we get to the 1980s, around 40 to 50 years later, a lot of the architects that are now becoming the modernists of India are picking up on all of his 5 points, and we can see them employed in places like this. Obviously not all of them, you're not gonna have a bunch of concrete on pilotis, but the idea of activating the roofscape, it's not just a Corbu idea, it does go back culturally. A lot of Indian residences do use the top. Here we have this right here. What is this called? The screen on the second floor that allows you to ventilate the upper floors of the building. Why are you guys whispering it? The mushroom.
Okay.
Yeah, so these are the screen systems that we talked about. Notice that the first floor is articulated quite differently from the upper floors where the residences are located. So these up here are gonna be fully shaded, right, as the sun comes in. No direct daylight actually gets into the skin, which is all the way back there. And you can easily place plants, jars, ways to cool down the air as it comes into the property. This campus was built, again, for pedestrians with the idea of exploration in mind. So when you have areas like this where you don't fully see the full picture, right, we know that there's something behind there, we know that there's something through that hallway, but we don't quite see it. It actually excites the human mind. It's one of the 14 principles of biophilia. If you're not familiar with them, I encourage you to read into them because they're really great ways to design nice buildings because of the way that our psychology works. When you see something like this, you're more inclined to want to go see it because the building is hiding it from you, right? It's the same principle. If you're told not to do something, you're going to want to do it. And so having something like this, having a bridge go through the top floor like that, it encourages you to walk through the building and actually explore it. All right, the next couple of projects are going to be in Rajasthan, which is the westernmost province of India, and this is where we're going to have a lot of that big desert area. It's going to be very similar to the climate of the Middle East and therefore the climate of Las Vegas. So this is a small girls' school. We see the idea of enclosure. It's a symbol, according to the architect Diana Kellogg, it is a symbol of femininity, but it is also, as far as the environment goes, a way to cool down the interior space to create a fully shaded courtyard so that you can use it throughout the day. Notice that they're using a pretty thin floor plate in order to allow in plenty of daylight to come into the actual classrooms. All right, so very, very arid region. This is more of a sandy desert than ours. And we see that they use the idea of screens throughout the whole thing. For one, it allows the wind to come in. Secondly, it allows us to self-shape some of those major facades. And third, it allows us to activate the space by creating benches where you don't necessarily have to have a physical bench out, but you can have it cast into the actual patterns. So screens are a really great way to add visual interest to your buildings, but also add secondary spaces like these that once again make people want to explore the building. People love the idea of shelter. If you go to a restaurant, you're more likely to want to sit around the peripheries of the restaurant, and that's just a natural psychological response by humans. It feels uncomfortable to be in the center because you don't really know which way to look, and humans are naturally going to be looking for threats, right? It goes way back to our hunter-gatherer days. So if you're up against a wall or you're in a booth, you're going to feel more secure because that's one less surface to think about guarding yourself from. And so when we have spaces like these that are inset into the walls, they are always going to capture the imagination of people, and especially children who like to explore small areas like that. Right there we have some daylight coming in from the top and not the bottom. You don't really want all of that dust coming into the building. And by the time that we have the sunshine come in, it's not really going to be hitting the students or most of the teaching space. We have lots of light colors, lots of thermal mass. This allows daylight to bounce in without the heat coming into the actual building. Right. This is another school. There's a lot of great schools on here. This is also located in Rajasthan, India. What do you notice about the floor plan in this school as far as openings go? And this is, by the way, true north is upwards. Yes?
They all face away from the sun.
Mm-hmm. Yes, most of them, if you notice, are opening upwards. If you look at a lot of the southern facades, right, a lot of them are gonna be very solid. Whereas the top ones are gonna be a little bit more transparent. And that's because this lies on the northern hemisphere, so most of the sun is gonna come from the southern side at very limited times of day, specifically in the height of summer, when you maybe have some sunlight coming towards the top. It's a really good idea as architects to study the sun. So when I was in my third year, they made us pick like any object, a box, a cube, and then you had to take a picture of it every single day for the length of the semester to see how the shadows change. And it's really interesting once you do studies like that and you start really thinking about it, you'll start noticing things more and more on buildings, how efficient some of them can be or how inefficient others can be. And if you look at the north side of your house around summer solstice, so like June 21st, 22nd, you'll notice that sun does directly hit the northern facade as well because it's slightly over. So you do have to consider how you're going to shade the northern facade for that very limited time during the year. Because of the fact that it's directly in the summer, we want to make sure that it's nicely shaded. So what we see the architects do up here is that they extend those walls outwards so that as the sun is setting on the west, even if it were to hit this facade right here, as the sun comes this way, this wall right here would essentially block it. Why else would you want your thermal mass to extend outwards that much?
To create shade?
To create self-shading buildings, but also the further you have your thermal mass out, the more it's going to capture the heat before it gets into the building. So from the south side, we look at the building, and it looks like this. Very enclosed, fully shaded. It's going to be receiving the most direct sunlight, and you can see it's going to be combating it with a bunch of very thick concrete walls. You look at the northern facade, and it reads very differently. So your goal as architects should always be, you can show anyone any side of your building, and they'll be able to tell you which is the north side and which is the south side, as well as the eastern and west sides. You should be able to read that differently. So that's why it's a very bad idea to apply the same type of facade strategy to all four sides, because the environment acts very differently on them. And if you treat all of them equally, you're going to have either a lot of enclosure on your north side or a lot of heat gain on your south side. Right, so we can see how, as the sun comes from the west right here, as it's setting, these walls allow us to fully shade that screen there. Had this wall been right here, you would be receiving a lot of daylight inside of this area here, which is fully glass, and that's not going to feel very good on the inside. And notice how they actually play with the angles as well, right? So you want to think about which angle is the sun going to come in, and you can use that as part of your architectural strategy to create a really fun interplay of different wall planes. Now on the inside of it, there is a courtyard of sorts, and the whole thing is enclosed by this veranda, shade structure. So what it does is it allows students to move from one building to the other, and it's going to be very comfortable, right? If you've ever walked from the UNLV gym to Lead Library in the middle of the summer semester, it's very hot. There's not really a lot of shade compared to the green area out here where you have trees lined the whole way. It's so much more comfortable, and you'll notice there's a lot more foot traffic up here during the summer because of that very reason. So if you give people shaded areas, they're more likely to actually walk. And again, we're using a very bright red color in order to really combat the coolness and the blueness of the actual sky. So if you also read into psychology, if you allow too much blue light in, especially on your northern facade where you're not going to get direct sunlight, you can make really depressing spaces that way. Even though they have daylight, it's going to look really blue and really sad in there. So by having the red, you allow the light to come into the space and be a very warm tone. The inside uses a lot of screen systems as well. All of the hallways are fully open and ventilated. They don't have any AC system, and so you have to allow the breeze to run through all of those corridors by using screens like this. And this is a good image because it shows us two different types of screens, right? An interior screen as well as an exterior one that actually has a little bit of thermal mass, so that everywhere where students move through the space For one, you have a safer space because you can actually look through the building, which is one of the concerns of CCSD. And secondly, you have that ventilation and that breeze coming, so you don't have stagnant air inside the building. Right, so notice how much nicer it looks back there, where we have the daylight, than it does up here, where we have all of these fluorescents. If you want to look at this up close, these were the strategies that they followed, right? So we know that they're talking about solar orientation, ventilation, courtyard, the idea of creating a self-shaded structure, screening, veranda, lots of the strategies that we talked about employed in a way that once again really looks quite modern, that could easily, exist out here in the desert and probably fit into the vernacular. This is another one. This is just a simple slide. There isn't really much to say about this building except it has a really great system of screens. This is a residential tower. So when we look at residential towers, a lot of times they're going to be fully made out of glass because that is the concept that emerged from New York City and from Chicago, where we have the birth of the skyscraper. And in order to push this very modern, cosmopolitan agenda, like what we have at City Center and at the Cosmo Tower, it's believed that you do have to make it out of full glass. And if you look at the Aria or the Vidara with the death ray that we talked about, you go to the websites and the architects talk about how sustainable this is because their glass is able to be, I believe it's 3 layers of glass, low E, and it has like argon gas inside of it, which is pretty standard. That's good. But this is better, right? You can still have that glass, but you can allow the sunlight to be filtered through. And so this way your building doesn't have to work as hard in order to cool itself as perhaps a room at the Aria does. Right. This is another one by the same architect. Once again, we see the concept of reading a building and its orientation just from the facade. So based off this image, where is north and where is south? And what facade is this one? What was that?
On the right north.
So we're looking at the north facade, you think? Or
I think it's so.
No, we're looking at the west.
Yeah.
Or east.
yes. All right, so you have to dissect where the shade is coming from, right? So we know that we're blocking sun from that direction. So that's going to be south. It's open this direction, so this is going to be north. And so this way is going to be east. So yes, this is the east elevation, and you can easily read that if you analyze what the building is doing. So we have this really, really beautiful dichotomy where we have the whole north of the facade. If you stand on the north side of this campus, it all opens out towards you. And I have a couple images where you see full glass everywhere you look. If you look at it from the north looking south, or sorry, the south looking north, you will see that it is all fully enclosed. So it's almost like you have 2 separate buildings, depending on which way you actually look at it. And you'll notice lots of self-shading and a lot of protection for those actual windows. Notice that they have alternating angles, so there are really fun ways to play with how you articulate these facades. They also, once again, add in a splash of color, a great way to make sure that that light is not directly blue. This was the strategy that the architects went with. Right, so you'll notice that they perfectly captured or calculated how to fully shade these to use a different angle in each one of them, but still make sure that they are fully shaded from the sun and sun's exposure. Here we see that they are redirecting views as well. So north is south in this case, should be flipped that way. And we also see the strategy of opening up, right? It's almost like a tree that is opening and branching. And we could probably assume that they're doing something with the prevailing wind pattern right here. Same thing with the breaks in the building itself. They allow for ventilation to cross through these areas. Right? So as you look at it from the north, fully exposed and open to you, and even then notice that though we do have them fully shaded, they're still using screens inside of here to direct daylight back into the actual house itself. A window is never as effective as a window that actually has an awning or some sort of horizontal piece that is going to allow the light to bounce into your home. We have huge glass openings in this case, right? The actual community center. fully expressed as frames. Notice we do read form follows function right here, so we do have a vertical circulation shaft that has full screen. So we do articulate it a little bit differently from this. It doesn't have as much thermal mass, but it does have a screen of sorts to allow to ventilate. Why would you want ventilation in this area? Right, so if we go back to this, right, those are those junctions that we looked at. This is what they look like in perspective. So why do you want those to have screens instead of this same facade motif?
Because it lets the air pass through?
Yeah, for the, sole purpose of ventilation, you want the air to move through that. You also don't have a natural refrigeration or mechanical system for your circulation space, right? It's a really environmentally friendly strategy to not be cooling your hallways. You're only gonna be there for a couple of seconds, so it really doesn't make a lot of sense. It makes more sense to do something like this. Allow them to be passively cooled. It might be a couple degrees hotter, but at the end of the day, you're not living in the hallway, right? You're living in your unit, which will most likely have AC inside of there. All right. We're gonna begin moving westward now. Look at our modern project in Iran. This is a really beautiful building. It is an office space where we have the idea of screen, enclosure, courtyard used in a more vertical manner. So sometimes students will ask, how can I have a courtyard in a space if I don't really have a big plot of land, or if I'm forced to have a bunch of square footage, why would I use a bunch of my space to just be open? And this case study is a really great example of how you can incorporate the concept of what the courtyard is in really, really thin grooves on the sides of the building. So for one, you'll notice that their screen system is also their window system and is also their lighting system all at once. So they use these bricks, which do have a structural rebar behind them in order to allow them to stand up as vertically as they do. They do have little pieces of glass inset into them. So we know the space inside of here is going to be refrigerated. It is going to have some daylight come in, but it's going to be very diffused. So notice we don't see a bunch of little circles all over the ground where the sun is coming into the space. Then we have the idea of slits and grooves cutting through the building itself. So if you study the floor plate of each one of these, you'll notice that there are different openings going through it to create spaces like this. For one, you want to be able to look at plants. They allow you to calm your mind, which is a really great strategy, especially in an office or in an educational building. Right, and secondly, they allow you to open the windows behind the screens, and as the air comes in, where you don't have the fritted glass. So notice in this case, because we don't have the glass that's diffusing the daylight, we do see the full circles. The air can come in, you can open your window, and it's going to be passively cooled by the plants in this area. So this is the technology, and sometimes architects do have to get creative about how they articulate their facades. They might have to even patent an entire technology. So in this case, the architects decided to create a brick because they felt it was the vernacular of the region to build with adobe bricks, but they wanted to give it a more modern twist, and they wanted to have a number of different functions for it. So you can have your run-of-the-mill solid brick, right, great thermal mass. You can also cut these out, so now it's a screen that can fully ventilate where your wind can move through. You can also add glass pieces inside of there so you can have the daylight come in while not allowing the wind and the outside elements. You can also add these, which are lighted blocks, and those allow you to diffuse the daylight so you don't get the big circles on your floor, so you don't get that direct sunlight. You can also have copper pieces inset into it to create another piece of decoration, or finally you can just have the grooves inside of it. So they had all of these different strategies, and they use them in different areas depending on the facade, on what they want to do with the area. What we also see is that they create a screen system that now meshes into those bricks. So this right here is not a brick, it is a screen, it is much lighter, but by having this articulated module, they can now use it throughout the entirety of the facade. And so now, if you don't have direct sunlight coming into this facade, let's say this is the east facade, once it's sunset, you're not gonna have direct sunlight coming in. You can open up the screens, open up your windows and allow your building to ventilate. If it's the morning when the east facade is fully receiving sunlight, you can entirely close it up, and now it reads as a uniform facade. And so the building is able to transform itself, and it looks very different depending on the time of day. And so this architect takes the idea of reading the orientation from the facade a step further. Not only can you read the orientation, but you can also read the time of day based on what people are doing and how they are utilizing the tools that the architect has given them. We're now going to look at two case studies in Mexico. In, I believe it's the Chihuahua deserts. Does anyone know the name of the desert in Baja California?
Chichuan?
Chichuan? Okay. All right, someone look it up.
Chihuahua?
Chihuahuan?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So it's going to be a similar desert to ours. It's not going to be as dry as the Mojave. The Mojave is the driest in the region, but still very hot. It can be hotter in the Chihuahuan desert sometimes. So we're going to look at some residential strategies in this case. These are supposed to be little dwellings out in the desert. This firm created about 4 of them, and each of them explores different strategies that are meant to show us how you can live a remote life out in the desert if you wanted to off the grid with a house that could be passive and allows you to live comfortably. So right off the bat, we do see the concept of a huge overhang. But I want us to look at the orientation. What do you notice about the placement of those overhangs, those big screens on the main residence block?
On the east and west side?
Yes, they're on the east and west side for the most part, right? The northern facade, on the other hand, is for the most part pretty unoccupied. That's where we're gonna have a lot of the glass so that we have diffused daylight come in. This is what it looks like in sections. So we do have a semi-courtyard space. It is not really fully enclosed, so it's not a full courtyard, but the concept still stands. You can fully ventilate it. You do have the hole in order to have the heat escape upwards. But what I want you to notice in section is this region over here. What is this? An example of?
Double roof.
Not a double roof, a double ceiling. Yeah, so we have our roof up on top. When you put it on the bottom, that is going to be our double ceiling. And so because you'll notice, this is not a very solid ceiling. You can easily have the air come into that area and stay trapped up there. Right, this is the double ceiling. You can have the air come up into that area. I'll show you. And then it can escape out these grooves over here. I do want to go back to show you something in these images though. First, you'll notice that there are slidable windows and doors, so we do have a more modernist Bauhaus approach, right, with the indoor-outdoor concept right here. It's something that most of the homes up on the hills tend to do. You'll notice that they also use the concept of veranda in this case. So if you go back to look at the orientation, this is going to be your western facade right here. As the sun comes in from the west, it will hit these at an angle for most times of the year, and this is going to be fully shaded without having to use as much material, without having to use a huge piece of thermal mass. You still have the same amount of desired shade. In our courtyard, we have these right here. These are going to be traditional in a lot of Mexican residential architecture, climbing plants. Right, they add a little bit of color, but they also help cool down the wind as it comes through the screen itself. And so we see the same motif is used throughout the home, whether as thermal mass and shading or as a place for our greenery to actually grow on. This is another one. These are, by the way, called the Sacatitos houses. There's 1, 2, 3, and I believe there's a 4th one as well. And they're just little prototypes that the firm keeps doing. So in this case, we see the concept of frames being used. And just based off this, without looking at the site plan, which facade, which of the 2 facades does this have to be?
South.
It's actually not the south in this case. It's gonna be our west or east facade. So one of the things to keep in mind about solar orientation, your north facade, easy to control, very little sunlight coming in, you can have very small overhangs. Your south facade, we know, has to have big overhangs because the sun is gonna be hitting it at the highest point at noon. Your east and your west facades are gonna be the hardest ones to control daylight because sunlight is hitting it horizontally, right? As your sun is rising or as it's setting, it is coming into your building horizontally. And so you have to find ways to block it while not blocking your views. If you're thinking about the southern facade, the sun is coming down in this direction. So all you have to do is extend out horizontally. You don't have to create a vertical screen as much. So this is how it's truly oriented. I flipped the actual floor plan so we could take a look at it. All right, so we can see it's for the most part almost true north, laid out right here. What do you notice is on our southern facade? What room is that?
Garage.
Yeah, so why would you want to place your garage on that southern facade? Yeah, that's where most of the heat is going to be coming in. And because we are using the concept of frames on the east and on the west, we have to have some other type of strategy for the south over here. Sometimes aesthetics are going to be very important. In fact, they're always important. And if you're trying to really articulate the concept of frames, you can't necessarily use frames over here because it's going to ruin the illusion that they go from side to side. So you have to find some other way to minimize the amount of solar heat gain on the south side of your home. So what strategy is going on here when you place the garage and the storage on that south area to protect the interior? What would this be called?
Massing? Massing? Thermal massing?
Sort of. It does have thermal massing, but what is the airspace itself acting as?
Solar chamber.
I think it's like strategy number 3 or 4. It's a buffer zone, right? So remember, buffer zones are regions that you can go into, you can use, but you're not really in there for that long. And it doesn't matter that it heats up all that much. It's a car, right? Shade is good enough. You don't need to make sure that it's fully in AC. So though we have some solar heat gain on this area because we are not using big overhangs, the architect has employed a different strategy. If they're not using shade, if they are not using a screen, then they can use a buffer zone so that your real facade, if you think about it, is all the way back here, fully shaded, and it has a whole air buffer to protect it from absorbing anything from the south. The north side, on the other hand, you'll notice is fully usable space that is, I believe, the primary bedroom with a whole outdoor area to sit in, fully opened, glass. You don't have to worry about the same things as the southern facade. So with this one, you should also be able to read where north, south, east, and west are just based on the moves that are going on here. Right, so there's our system of screening. Once again, you want vertical shading when you have the east and west facades because our sun is hitting us horizontally. The center of it does have an opening. This is also not really a courtyard, but it does allow for cross ventilation. We're now going to move into the Sonoran Desert. We're going to look at Arizona, and then we're going to look at one small local example. Keep in mind that there's lots and lots and lots of great architecture in New Mexico, Arizona, a little bit of it in Nevada. I'm not showing you too much of it because it's what you're going to be exposed to for most of your architectural student careers. So it's good to get a taste of other areas of the world as well. This is the Catalina House by Rick Joy. If there is someone that knows how to work in Sonoran Desert, it is Rick Joy. He's considered one of the masters of Southwest architecture, specifically the residential architecture. And we notice he's using a lot of the same strategies that we saw both in Mexico, in India, that we saw in Burkina Faso. Northern facade, once again, quite transparent, very open to allow daylight in. Southern facade, more solid. Eastern facade, more solid. And then western facade, also quite solid. So you're trying to minimize all of the heat gain on those sides. So based on the interior image, which side is the north side? Left or right?
Right.
Yes. So now you guys are learning how to read orientation when it's done correctly. This is gonna be our northern facade right here. One of the things you'll notice Southwestern architects love to do, in part because of our mid-century heritage and the gooky stuff that happens, but also in part because of the way in which heat actually moves in a building. We love to use butterfly roofs, and both of these next two examples use it. So a butterfly roof, if you're not familiar, this is a traditional gable. Butterfly goes the opposite way. The reason that works in the desert is we don't get a lot of rain, right? So it's not really a concern to have a bunch of snow pile up in that area. And when you have correct weatherproofing, you can actually have the rain come in and you can collect it for rainwater collection, or you can use it and redirect it into a garden space, which many architects tend to do. The other thing that's great about this is you maximize the amount of daylight that's coming in here, and because hot air rises, your interior stays quite cool, because that hot air will go and sit around in that upper area over here. You'll have enough daylight, and notice that Rick Joy is using a very warm organic material up here to combat again the coolness of this light. Another common motif, so you can see the butterfly a little bit better right here. I want to go back to this. The idea of sun washing or light washing. So a lot of architects will also have a big thermal mass, which we clearly see here, right, fully expressed, big thermal mass. And then they'll have the roof, and rather than having the roof butt into the thermal mass, they will leave a slight little opening, a small sliver, so that once again you can read the time of day using the architecture. So as the sun hits directly overhead, it downcasts on that wall, and it pretty much highlights all of the texture, all of the different layers that go into it, and it creates a really beautiful play on light. The light then is redirected into the interior and helps illuminate this little living space out here. My only critique of Rick Joy and his school of architects is they don't diffuse their daylight with screens, and you'll see that in a couple images. It looks really dark in some areas. So there's the butterfly roof where it comes down. In this case, he is using a trough so that the water will drain this way, fall into here, and it will irrigate this naturally. There we have two thermal mass walls as you come in, and you do have a fully shaded area. I believe this was on the southern facade, so it makes sense that you need a huge overhang to combat it, so that as it comes in at noon, it will really hit it up until here. Right, but this is my critique of a lot of Southwestern architects. In trying to be so poetic with how the light comes into the building, it does create a very harsh play of shadow and light. If you're into that sort of thing, that's cool. I personally like diffuse daylight a little bit more, so I think this strategy is nice as a showpiece for like a dining room, but I wouldn't necessarily want like my office space or my bedroom to be using that same technique. And lastly, we're going to look at a local piece by the architect Eric Strain. So if you went out to the Mormon Fort, if that was your precedence, you probably went to the visitor center. If you have not gone, I recommend you do it, not for the history of the site necessarily, but just to look at the architecture. Once again, we do have a butterfly roof on top, very thick roof. That's a bit of a thermal mass up here. We also have this wall here. What do you think his idea was with placing a huge wall as soon as you come in? This is the front door. Why would you want a huge, massy wall as you come in to the Mormon Fort? Yes.
To kind of, go on to the history of the site and tell you that this is like a fort, so like you're being granted entry to the building because that's fortified.
Yes, that was his exact idea. He wanted to play off the history of the fort, which on the outside, you'll remember, was very solid, adobe brick, very limited openings. You do see a couple of slits on the sides over here where the lights are. Those are glass that's about this thick that bisects that wall. Now, you don't think that does a lot, but because glass is able to reflect light within itself, as we have our eastern sun shine through it, it creates a really, really beautiful play of light on the interior. You can also look through the glass, so if you stand on the inside of the visitor center and you look at the glass directly through it, it creates this really cool like refraction effect of what's going on the outside. What you see, these are the window panes that bisect onto the interior. If you stand here, I recommend to do it. It does look really cool. This is an example of a rain chain. So whereas Workjoy uses a rain trough that's very thick and it just pours the water down, because the Mojave Desert does not have as much rain, a rain chain is actually a much better example, and it allows us to control how the rain comes down. The way it works is water tends to have, it tends to like to find surfaces to stick to. So if you have a chain, you're telling the water to come down following that chain directly into this area here. So you'll notice that if you go out here on a day that it's raining, you don't really have a lot of water splashing in these areas because you are carefully controlling how water moves. And so it goes to show that yes, we're building in a desert, but you do have to consider how the rain is going to come into your building, because that's one of the big problems that Las Vegas has. We have a ton of flooding every single time it rains because our original urban planners didn't really consider how water would move through the valley because it's so dry. But once it does, remember that desert soil is so dense that water just runs over it. It does not seep into the ground. And so you have a ton of influx of water into a lot of areas, especially in the lower valley. If you also go to the Springs Preserve, there's a really great rain chain example, and it just pours when it's raining. It's so beautiful. All right. We're gonna leave it off there. Does anyone have any questions? I did get a question on how to sign up for Duck Duck Shed. So if you go back to last Thursday's lecture 20, whatever last Thursday was, the last couple of slides tell you how to sign up. You just have to email. Has anyone tried emailing them yet and gotten your tickets? Yes. Have they replied back?
They
With the
reply,
tickets?
they just say, yeah, thank you for interesting, like very interested. And they sent me a receipt
Okay.
of the concession and it's like $0.
Okay, cool. Alrighty then. That's all I have for you guys today.